Welcome to the Culture Podcast, the podcast that helps you build and sustain extraordinary cultures to drive employee and organizational growth. Here are your hosts, Marissa Levin and Jennifer Brown.
Good afternoon. This is Marissa Levin, and I am co-founder of Successful Culture International, and I am here with my partner, Jen Brown, and we are so happy today to bring to you one of the world's greatest experts on communication and organizations. His name is Steven Gaffney, and I'm honored to be able to call him a longtime friend and mentor and advisor to me as I've grown my businesses. If you don't know about Steven, you should check him out at stevengaffney.com, but he is truly one of the most sought after experts on the subject of honest communication. He works with leaders around the world, from Fortune 500 associations, all over our U.S. government. He's also a best-selling author, speaker, and keynoter. And he now is taking his expertise on communication and really honing in on helping organizations build the most high-performing teams that they possibly can have. So we're going to talk to him today about how he uses communication and his proprietary and unique approach to building high-performing teams to helping companies build their best cultures. Steven, welcome. We're so excited to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So we can just kind of jump right into this. Tell us a little bit about, how you became so passionate about honest communication in organizations, and then how you now have parlayed that into creating high-performing teams in organizations.
Sure. So it's interesting because ever since I was a little kid, I was always honest, but too honest. You might say, can a kid be too honest? Yeah, I was the kind of kid that if I dented the coffee table, I would tell my parents. Probably something a little bit crazy about me versus my siblings. They would say, what table? And I never knew that that would actually end up parlaying into a great business. But basically, here's what happened. I had a business, and then I started doing seminars for photographers, film and radio commercial directors on communication and motivation. And that went really well. And then eventually I gave up that business and just did the seminar business. And then that morphed into honest communication because I've always been a very upfront person. Mm-hmm. So, and I didn't even think people could make a living by focusing on honesty until one day a friend of mine said, you should be teaching this stuff in your seminars. And then I got really focused on honest communication because what I discovered is this: the number one problem in relationships, and if everybody forgets everything out of what we're going to talk about, the absolute number one problem is lack of honest communication. And what I mean by honest communication isn't the outright lies. The biggest problem is not what people say, it's what they don't say to each other. It's what they leave out. It's where we're saying, gosh, if they had just told me, I could have done something about it. So it happens individually, happens with our individual relationships, but it also happens in teams, in organizations, personal, all over. The biggest problem is not what people say, it's what they're not saying. And that's what happened.
Well, I've been fortunate to have really a front row seat as I've watched you really take your passion for honest communication and bring it into organizations to help them build their cultures. So I was so excited to hear that you really have kind of narrowed the focus into creating high-performing teams. Can you talk a little bit about that shift and now how you're impacting organizations through your work with high-performing teams?
Absolutely. So what happened is actually it's not narrowed the scope. Actually, Marissa and Jen, what happened is it expanded the scope. And here's what happened. I was always doing honest communication. And one day a client of mine said, I've got these teams that I'm launching. And could you take these honest communication strategies and actually put it into like a teamwork and do some kind of facilitation and something like a reboot? And that's how the reboot was born. And the idea of a reboot with a team, which is the key to making any team a high-performing team, is the same principle of a computer. When there's problems with a computer, if you turn it on and turn it off and then turn it on, it gets rid of the junk, but it keeps the foundation. So in relationships, what happens is we develop this junk, these issues, and we got to clear it up because it slows us down. But the worst part is people get stuck in the past. So we need to hit reboot so we're able to move forward. And so out of these reboots, then it really became even more of a brand for me and really focusing on on making teams really high performing teams. So now that's a big, huge bulk of the work. It doesn't mean that I don't do honest communication, and it's still a basis of the work, even with the teamwork. But the big focus is these high performing teams. And it's been so much fun working with people because I basically developed a process that I can take any group of people and I can get them working together very effectively and moving fast. In fact, I'd kind of like to help the Redskins one day. They need help. But anyway, that's another side point.
Steven, can you share with us how you go about converting a team into a high-performing team, some of the principles around the reboot itself?
Yeah, there's actually 4 major steps. The first step we do is everybody gets an interview, and we find out a confidential interview before actually I go into the group, and we find out the real issues that are going on. Then that turns into a report, and we use that report to jumpstart getting the issues out when I bring the team together. And the reason why that's important is because to take time to facilitate and draw people out in a group level and have them share takes a lot of time. But interesting enough, if you get them talking one-on-one and then it produces a report of the issues and you don't attach a person's name to the issues, then when they're all reading that report, it gets the elephants all out in the room, and then we got to talk about it. So we do this analysis, and then when I'm with the group, then I do 3 major steps. The first step is actually teaching these 11 essential elements of a high-performing team. And I discovered by working in the mining industry, the hospitality industry, the defense, military, there's 11 essentials of a high-performing team. I inject that in the team, and it's also a set of tools so that we can then discuss the issues. So the first step is the analysis. The second step is teaching these 11 essentials, which are basically a set of tools. And then we take those with that as a backdrop, and then we talk about those issues and we get them resolved. And so that's the third step, is getting it resolved. And that is really how we move it forward. And then I also add in another process that is called the 2-hour and 18-minute strategy. And that's where you take an issue or an idea, and within 2 hours and 18 minutes, it becomes a plan with accountability that they move out on. So at the end of these reboots, they're actually a plan with accountability moving forward. But that's basically the process. So the first step is the analysis. The second step is these 11 essentials. Third step is talking about these issues to get them resolved. And this fourth step is to give them a strategy, this 2-hour and 18-minute strategy, so they can use it on key issues, but also use it once they leave the session.
Do you have an example of a really difficult team that you had to work with where there was just a lot of issues happening, and how through this process the team was able to move to a high-performing state?
Oh, I'll give you an example. It's a lot of fun. Of course, I got to drop out the names and the organization.
Sure, absolutely.
But I had an organization I did a reboot about 5 years ago, and I still keep in touch with this client, and because he's moved on to various organizations. And he was telling me a few months ago when I was talking to him, he said, I still stay in touch with that group, and it's working great. Well, what was so interesting is that group that I worked with 5 years ago, I'll never forget, they were incredibly dysfunctional, to the point that nobody thought it could be fixed. And also, they didn't even want me in there, but except my client. But
right.
I got in there, and it got all fixed. And here's the neat part about it. It has stuck. Because you think about a lot of seminars and a lot of processes these consultants develop, and a lot of it doesn't stick. But what I found out is this process, as long as they're using the process, it'll stick. And so that team is still performing very, very well today. But it's been fun, Jim, because I've worked with teams that are very dysfunctional, like one I just brought up. Another one, I had a client of mine say to me, look, just before you go into the group, just don't screw this up. Because it's really messed up. And he said, are you sure you can fix it? And this is what I said to him. I will get this fixed, but you have to do exactly what I'm telling you to do, and it will get fixed. And you know what? It got fixed. But then I've also gotten a chance to work with teams that are working well, but they just want to make them work better. So I worked with this very, very high-level group where my client said, look, I got a bunch of great performers, and we're a good team, but I want to make them an extraordinary team. So it's not just dysfunctional. It's been also all over, all different types of groups, but it's been so much fun.
That's great. And it sounds like the process that you're using has some components where there's ongoing work even after you wrap up with them. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it's sounding like there's accountability that's actually placed on the team to help keep the principles that they learn going and keep this kind of learning and development alive.
Yeah, see, At the end, I tell them and leave them with best practices so they can use it without me having to go back in there.
Mhm.
But a lot of work is expanded just because once somebody goes through a reboot, then they want other teams to go through this reboot process. And if you want, we can give people details. I don't want people listening and thinking, okay, well, they're just talking about the process, but give us some meat behind it. For example, we could talk about, how do you tell the difference between a team and not a team? Because most teams in the workplace are not teams.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I also wanted to ask you. So, yeah, going into detail would be great, but I also wanted to ask you. A lot of organizations work with their matrix organizations. I know, in my first company, which was a consulting firm, we were always having people shift around in the teams based on different projects. So, how do you accommodate people coming into the team that may or may not be trained on your model? And then also, as people in organizations shift all the time. So you bring in a new employee and all of a sudden they're put on a team and you've got a team of 8 people and 7 of them have been trained in your model and the other one hasn't. How do you accommodate those types of changes?
Well, through a lot of different ways. Of course, the train the trainer type of model where I'm training them on how to do training of these reboots. Sometimes I've worked with individual people so they get them, up to speed with the rest of the team when they come in there. But what's really interesting is once people know these 11 essentials of a high-performing team, that team they just teach people coming on in. And also,
Okay.
I've done speeches on these just 11 essentials. So here's a good example. There's a client of mine that I've done a lot of work with, and I did a speech just on these 11 essentials so that each of these leaders could go back and do essentially their own reboot, or at least use these 11 essentials as a backdrop on what to do with every team. Because here's what I found out. When it's all said and done, you give me any problem that a team has, and through these 11 essentials, if they do these 11 essentials, it will get fixed. And I know that's a kind of a bold statement for a consultant to say, but I have yet to see where this system does not work as long as they're using these 11 essentials.
I just was going to ask if you could share some of the essentials.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I was chomping at the bit for, because there's so many different ways to kind of to slice this up. But here's the first one, or not the first one. And this, I don't mean but here's one. And they're not in priority order, so we can go through as many as you want. But one of them is everyone shares to get the unsaid said. Now, everyone shares to get the unsaid said. One of the interesting things about a group is a lot of teams are run by the idea of who wants to share something, and pretty much the most vocal people dominate. Well, here's the reason why we make bad decisions, because often they think the loudest voice wins. And we have to counteract that. And what I found out is very quiet people can have incredible wisdom. So everyone shares to get the unsaid said. And so what I do in a reboot is I toss out questions, but it is not negotiable that they don't answer. Everybody answers. And what people realize by the end of going through the reboot is there's incredible wisdom in the room. Well, the essential element that I'm using is that everyone shares to get that unsaid said. So you don't let people hide out on a team, period. Now, people might say, and rightfully so, if you call on somebody who's not used to being called on, they might get upset, and they might. But here's what I found out. If you do 2 other things, they will not be upset. If you actually create an emotional, safe environment, and what I mean by that is, have you ever had somebody say, "Oh, please, I want to hear your honest feedback," and then you give them honest feedback and they flip out on you?
Yeah.
Right.
Next time you say, "I'm not going there," and I bet you there are people in your life who go, "Oh, I'm not going there." So you got to provide that emotional safety. But the biggest thing that most organizations and teams don't do is they don't reward honesty. So that's when somebody goes, "Thanks for sharing," but they don't use the information. So have you ever had somebody who does not get defensive in your life, and they ask you for advice, and you give them advice, but they never use the advice?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
They are providing emotional safety, but they're not doing anything with it. So people, if you call on them and you make them feel safe, and then you use essentially what they're saying, they will become uncorked. They'll share and share to their heart's content. Even some of the most quietest people I've worked with will really start to share, as long as you do what the emotional safety and then rewarding honesty.
Fabulous. And can you share several others of the essentials? I think.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So let's just randomly choose. How about Oh, the Vegas rule. It's another favorite of mine. The Vegas rule is what happens in here stays in here.
I love that.
Yes.
Have you ever been part of a team and you're starting to get that honest dialogue and you think, oh, I'm not going to bring it up because it's going to leave the room. There'll be leaks.
Right.
And so people don't trust each other. And so what happens is people won't share candidly in the room. And then we have outside meetings. In fact, very often the real meetings go on outside the meetings, which is incredibly destructive to organizations. But it also makes meetings utterly useless if you're not talking about the real issue.
Mm-hmm.
Good news is you establish the Vegas rule. Now, people might say, but I have said that and it hasn't worked. Well, the reason for it is we don't make clear statements and say, look, what happens in here stays in here. And then what you have to do at the end of the meeting is then say, before we depart, here's what we're going to agree to say. Because if you don't sandwich the Vegas rule, say the Vegas rule and then end with, here's what we're going to say. If you leave it up to people's discretion, they'll make innocent mistakes. So most people violate confidentiality because they really don't know any better. They don't think it's a big deal. Now, I know there's some people that do, and they're not good people necessarily, but the bulk of the people break confidentiality because they think, oh, well, I didn't think it was a big deal. So the Vegas rule is incredible. And when you do that, and think about it this way, I know I get so excited when I think about this. Friends, right? The people who you trust the most, you can say, please do not say to anybody, and they won't.
Mm-hmm.
But now think about this in your life. How many people do we know? How many friends? How many people do we have in our life who we know, if please don't say anything, that no matter what, they won't? And I'm talking, and you might say, well, I know a lot of people. No, I'm talking about, there's many people who say they won't break confidentiality until they're mad at you. And then they tell people. That's not okay.
Right.
So it has to be regardless of people's emotions, right? And when you think about it, that's very rare in life, which is sad. But the neat thing is when we establish this essential element, people really start to feel safe and they'll start to share things. And then these meetings and teams work fantastic.
I'm loving these essentials. Would you share 2 more with us?
Sure. Yeah, I just randomly choose it because okay. Focus on solutions, not blame. So the idea about focusing on solutions, not blame, is, have you ever been a part of a team where they just talk and talk and talk and talk and nobody gets things resolved? It's like a friend of mine said, it's like an airport, a plane circling the airport, but the plane never lands.
Right.
Because there's nothing moving forward. And so people sit there in meetings and they go, oh, this is horrible. They're banging their head against the wall. Well, there are 3 really great questions that anybody can use single-handedly in a meeting and will turn any conversation into a solution-oriented conversation. One of them is, what would you suggest? So here's a good example. You're sitting in a meeting and people are just going back and forth and you're going nuts. You just say, okay, look, and you don't have to be the leader. You just say, all right, so we're sharing a lot. So what do you think we should do, folks? And that automatically, you might have to say it a couple times, but that'll automatically move forward. I'll give you an example of how I use it, even when I'm doing seminars. I was doing a session for a governmental organization, and the people in the room were complaining about the leaders. They're like, the leaders don't do this, leaders don't do this. So I said, what would you suggest? And they said, well, we would do things, but the leaders aren't. I said, well, what would you suggest? Well, I said, so given that you're the only person you can control, what would you suggest? And it took about 3 or 4 times me asking it, but suddenly this group that went from complaining to starting to toss out solutions. So that's one question. Another great question to ask to focus on solutions, not blame, is you would say to somebody, what would it take for us to get agreement here, right? So you're sitting in a meeting and there's 2 camps, right? And they're just restating their opinions. You say, okay, hold on. We have 2 different things. What would it take to get some agreement here? Or this is even a good question to ask somebody who says no to you. So under what circumstances would have you change your mind, reconsider? So what I use that question when I'm with a group and a team, essentially because I can get them saying, all right, well, how do we get agreement here? And that has them also focused. So it's an excellent question. But my absolute favorite is not even those 2. My absolute favorite is, can you live with it? How many of us, myself included, have wasted stupid time in our life having the dumbest arguments and thought, what in the world was I doing? Who cares?
Right.
Yeah.
So you just say, can you live with it? So I'll give you a good example. I was doing a session for the Marines, And I had taught this facilitator these 3 questions. And the assignment was to get everybody in the room to agree to this planned pathway forward. And everybody agreed except this one lady. So he said, what would you suggest? And she said, I don't have a suggestion. He said, well, what would it take for you to agree? And she said, I don't know. And he said, well, can you live with it? She paused and thought and said, you know what? I can live with it. So I asked her later, I said, what was going on in your mind? And she said to me, these questions are not only good to ask other people, it's good to ask yourself. Because when he asked me that, I didn't have a suggestion. I didn't know what it would take to agree. But when he said, could I live with it? I thought, I'm holding up my entire team, it's a big group of people, but still the team, because, I don't agree with it. I don't think it's going to help the organization, but it's not a deal breaker. And if they're passionate about it, I'm going to let it go. In other words, people waste so much time because it's got to be my way or the highway. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you just got to say to somebody, can you live with it? Is it a deal breaker? Now, people ask me this question. What do you do if the person says, well, I can't live with it?
I was just going to ask you that.
Then you go back to the first question. You just say, well, what would you suggest? If you can't live with it, what's your suggestion then?
Right.
Anyway, these questions work like magic, and you can take any situation and have them focus on solutions instead of getting out of the blame game, which is, again, incredibly destructive, but it also doesn't help the organization move forward, and it brings everybody down. Who wants to go to work and have a blaming type of relationship and be part of a blaming team? It just brings us down. So the neat part is this makes motivation, excitement in the workplace by using these questions.
Well, what's interesting, Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, he has a philosophy known as disagree and commit, because he won't allow himself, or he won't allow the agendas to be held up by people who don't agree with him. So that is one of their organizational mantras, is disagree and commit. If you're not, if you can't get behind it, then that's something that you have to deal with, but you have to just disagree and commit and get on board, because we're moving forward.
I think it's key because, it reminds me of another really big problem in many organizations. They revisit decisions.
Right.
So, and this is where I see this a lot. And I tell teams when I have them together, I use the word sabotage. I said, you have to use heavy words and make this completely off limits in organizations. And what I mean by that is that's where somebody looks at you in the face and says, I agree with you. And then they back channel and actually do everything against it. And the problem is that organizations permit that behavior. And one form of permitting that behavior is somebody who will open up a dialogue that already has had a decision being made. Now, sometimes somebody will say, do you ever revisit decisions? And the answer is yes. If